10 years ago, Yuke's and THQ released a masterpiece and by far the greatest UFC game of all time, UFC Undisputed 3. EA Sports, who were the company who have been developing the UFC game since 2014, refused to make UFC games after they told Dana White that MMA wasn't a real sport, and that they would never make an MMA video game. EA Sports watched as MMA was becoming the fastest growing sport because of fighters like Chuck Liddell and Brock Lesnar. THQ and Yuke's, the companies that were making the WWE games at the time, took the opportunity to develop the UFC games, starting in 2009, ending in 2012. In those 4 years, THQ and Yuke's released 3 UFC games under the name UFC Undisputed. UFC Undisputed 2009 did very well, selling a respectable 3.5 million copies. However, 2010 underperformed, which led THQ and Yuke's to take 2 years off to focus on the final installment of this series, UFC Undisputed 3. If you ask anyone who has played this game, they will all agree that it is by far the best UFC game ever released. And this is because the game, although having some dated graphics and robotic striking animations by today's standards, did everything better than anything before it or after it. So let's start with the presentation. UFC Undisputed 3 has some of the most immersive and realistic presentation. Commentary is deep and is unique for every fighter. They also have realistic pre-fight fighter hype videos for every single fighter in the game, explaining to the player what each fighter is good at. Fighter introductions are what you would expect: full-length walkouts, fighter callouts, and when the fighter is about to touch gloves, they can either choose to touch gloves or refuse, which is a nice little detail. You also have actual weigh-ins in career mode and other game modes where you have the choice to be respectful or have an intense stare down. And if you choose to create a UFC event or replay the already pre-made events from the past, you will see Mike Goldberg and Joe Rogan talking about the event before it happens, just like they used to do in real life. It's really the closest we have gotten to a real life UFC presentation in video game form. You compare this to UFC games made by EA Sports and it's not even close. Moving on to gameplay, I could deadass make this section of the video an hour long, breaking down all the little things that THQ and Yuke's added in the game. Combat Sports Gaming has the perfect video that explains all the great gameplay features in UFC Undisputed 3, but I will quickly go through the main aspects of gameplay that make this game the best UFC video game of all time. Let's start with grappling. Now, this game captures how grappling really works in real life. When it comes to the clinch, it's the perfect system. Both fighters can fight for position and you can really control someone in the clinch, reverse their transitions to get a better position, and different fighters have different animations in the clinch. For example, Anderson Silva, who has a high clinch stat, can go straight to a full clinch tie plum and land heavy knees. BJJ experts can pull guard, and dominant wrestlers can complete throws from multiple clinch positions. For example, if you get double underhooks on John Jones, he can throw you over his head. This is a move exclusive to dominant wrestlers. And in certain clinch positions, if your opponent catches your knee or punch, they can perform a takedown or stop the attack, making you have to pick your shots. You can't just spam knees in the clinch because you will end up on your back. Even clinching on the cage is far better than any other game. If you get your opponent's back to the cage, you can put them in a full clinch tie plum, or you have multiple options to get the fighter to the ground. And talking about the ground game, this is the only UFC game that has the seated clinch position on the cage, which we see all the time in MMA. We would always see this in Khabib fights where he would trap his opponents on the cage and land strikes. And of course, in all of these clinch positions you have the ability to defend everything, but your character stats play a big factor whether you will have success in each position. For example, if I choose Brock Lesnar and I clinch a weaker heavyweight like Cain Velasquez, it will be much easier for me to muscle them to the cage. But because Cain Velasquez has better technique, it's easier for him to transition on Brock Lesnar. So depending on the matchup, both guys can do work in the clinch. Moving on to the ground game, UFC Undisputed 3's ground game is so ahead of anything that EA Sports UFC games have that it's honestly embarrassing. It has so many options that if you're really into grappling, you will feel like a kid in a candy store. First of all, the ground and pound in this game is brutal. You really feel the impact when you land heavy blows on the ground, and certain fighters ground and pound like Brock Lesnar can end the fight extremely quick. Just like in real life, if you eat huge shots on the ground, you will get stunned. You have the option to cover up and sway the punches to survive, or risk getting finished by catching a strike. And if you're the one who is throwing the bombs, you can advance to a more dominant position or go for a submission. You really need to work to finish someone on the ground, and when you do, it's very rewarding. The game even gives you the ability to feint ground strikes that can trick your opponent to catch a strike and get knocked out. And you can literally end the fight with one shot on the ground if you land a powerful shot. And with certain referees, they will take longer to stop the fight. So if you choose Mario Yamasaki as your ref, you can sneak in a couple of more shots while your opponent is out cold. This game has so much detail that even the commentators comment on how those extra shots were super unnecessary. And yes, this game has elbows and hammer fists, and gives you the choice to throw light ground and pound, which is quicker but less powerful, or wind up a big old hammer fist and smash your opponent's head into the canvas, which takes longer and is easier to catch, but if landed does a lot of damage. And elbows are realistic in this game because if you have a fighter that uses elbows, it will open up cuts on your opponent more than other strikes. And there isn't a block breaker on the ground like UFC 4, so you can defend strikes without having to worry about having to move your head. However, your block health will progressively get worse if you just lay there and eat shots to your block. On the ground, every fighter has different animations, and not every fighter can do the same transitions. A fighter like GSP can go for the guard straight to the side control. However, a fighter that isn't as good as a grappler as GSP has more steps to get into that position, which makes you feel more dominant when using a better grappler. And there are different grappling styles in the game. A guy like Brock Lesnar can't do the same slick grappling transitions as a character like BJ Penn, but he has the ability to shoot takedowns from his back or get in a dominant position on a reversal. Little details like this makes you feel like you're actually using the fighter you selected when on the ground, because they only perform moves that they would in real life, whereas in UFC 4, any fighter in the game can go from backside to backsetting, which isn't realistic. Brock Lesnar isn't going for backsetting, I'm sorry. When it comes to logic, UFC Undisputed 3 is among the best out of any MMA game. On the feet, a perfect shot can end the fight instantly. And the way you survive stun moments makes way more sense than UFC 4, for example. If timed correctly, you can catch your opponent's punch and hold them in the clinch to recover, or shoot a takedown on the feet, and on the ground you can catch your opponent's strikes and get to a safe position, which is actually what happens in real life. Each fighter's physical stats actually play a big factor in the game. When you're using a character like Brock Lesnar, you actually feel powerful, and you feel like you're using a real heavyweight. Fighters actually feel like they have weight and don't just slide across the octagon. The game is on the more realistic side and not as unrealistic as the EA Sports UFC games. Cuts are also very realistic. If you target one side of your opponent's face, cuts and bruises will develop on that side, and in this game, facial injuries look very realistic. And this game is so detailed that if your fighter is severely compromised, a doctor will come in to look at your fighter and either allow the action to continue or a doctor stoppage will occur. This is the only UFC game that has this feature, by the way. When you land shots to a certain area to your opponent's body, it actually shows physical damage too. If you or your opponent brutally get knocked out, your mouthpiece can go flying across the cage, and sometimes you will see your fighter still unconscious after the fight. And the health system is perfect and makes sense. You have each part of your body displayed on your HUD, and the more damage that part of the body takes, it gets more red to indicate damage. And if it completely gets red, that means that body part is in critical condition. The reason this system is perfect is because you can recover between rounds, and if you do a good job of defending yourself, that body part will slowly heal and return to neutral. They had a similar system in UFC 2, but it recovered way too quick, and in UFC 4, you can't regain back your health, which is unrealistic because We have seen fights where fighters take a lot of damage early in the fight, but then recover and go on to win the fight. And your block can get damaged too, but it is way stronger in UFC Undisputed 3, so players can't just block break you. Another cool thing in the game is that between rounds, your corner will actually give you real advice and give you instructions between rounds. The game actually has draws so that judges actually score round by round, and your fighter can quit in the fight and will be given a TKO loss, which are all things we see in MMA that are only in this game. Moving on to stand-up, every single fighter in the game is unique, and all 150 fighters plus DLC have their own unique stance and signature moves they did in real life. And what's even better is that there's variations of the same move. Fighters like Anderson Silva and Jose Aldo have unique head movement animations and counters. GSP and Brock Lesnar have their own signature takedowns that they do. Junior Dos Santos has his own uppercut animation and power straight. You really feel like you are using the fighter you selected. Not a single fighter in this game feels exactly the same or just a reskin. Since the game is 10 years old now, the striking animations are not going to be as fluid as the current UFC games. However, the stand-up is just so much fun that you forget you're playing a game that released on last gen. You always feel like you're in control of what your fighter is doing, and UFC Undisputed 3 is by far the most responsive game out of all of the UFC games. There are two different stamina systems in this game, which are the default stamina system and the simulation stamina system. The default is for a more casual experience, and you can perform way more moves without losing much stamina. Then for players who want a realistic experience, you have the simulation stamina system, which is extremely realistic. Depending on the difficulty you select, it can be very difficult, and you have to pick your shots and have to be very calculated in everything you do, or you will get completely gassed out. The AI in this game is also the best in my opinion, because the AI fights exactly like the character is assigned to. For example, if the AI is Jose Aldo, it will throw a lot of leg kicks and will be more aggressive, but if the AI is someone like Anderson Silva, it will be more patient and look for counters. It's one of the main reasons that people can still play this game 10 years later. UFC Undisputed 3 has 5 different difficulty settings, which starts at beginner, finishing with ultimate. It's pretty standard. You can also change the game rules to competition, which removes flash knockouts and doctor stoppages, and choosing equalized stats remove those same elements and makes every fighter's stats round up to 90. Me personally, I never really changed the game rules, but it's good they give you the option. UFC Undisputed 3 has by far the best career mode out of any UFC games. The creator fighter gives you so many customizable options to make your fighter how you want it. You can also make custom trunks and shirts and apply it to your fighter, and much more. You start off in the WFA and have to build your way up to make the UFC. You have the ability to select your camp, and each camp specializes in a certain aspect of MMA. I really love how the career mode has movies that play while you progress through your career that references moments that happened in the UFC. It really helps keep you invested in your career mode and want to make multiple career modes to unlock all the mini movies available in career mode. In the career mode, you can also go up and down in a weight class and fight in Pride, which we'll get to later. The career mode actually has good training drills, and you actually learn something about MMA playing through UFC Undisputed 3's career mode. I really suggest you guys give it a try if you haven't already. UFC Undisputed 3 also had Ultimate Fights mode that were only in the THQ UFC games, that were really good at not only educating newer fans on learning about some of the biggest moments in UFC from that era, but also rewarding you with movies associated from each fight. Remember a time where video games would actually reward you for playing the game? There were about 6 fights from each group of fights. Best of Pride was already included with the game, but buying the DLC at the time would give you ultimate submissions, knockouts, rivals, and ultimate upsets, which featured fights like Lesnar vs Carwin and Lesnar vs Velasquez, Nate Diaz vs Melvin Gillard, Anderson Silva vs Forrest Griffin, and Chuck Liddell vs Rich Franklin, to name a few. You could also play as either fighter and had to complete certain tasks to replicate the fight in order to gain the rewards. a really underrated mode that I always appreciated and enjoyed. This game also had title and title defense mode. What title mode was pretty much you basically work up the rankings to get a title shot, picking any character in the game, and once you get the belt, you unlock them in title defense mode, where you could defend the belt as many times as you want. Tournament mode was pretty much, you just make a tournament, put whatever fighters you want in there, and whoever wins the tournament wins the belt. The cool thing about tournament mode is you could basically recreate the old Pride tournaments that used to happen in this mode, which is pretty cool. And event mode is pretty much you make your own event that features all the presentation features I mentioned earlier in the video, and at the end of the event there would be things like knockout of the night, fight of the night, and submission of the night bonuses, and pretty much felt like you were watching and playing through an actual UFC event. That brings us to what helped make this game stand out from all the others, which was Pride mode. This mode gives you a completely different experience from UFC. You want soccer kicks and knees to the head of a downed opponent? You got it. The presentation and change of venue makes you forget that you're playing a UFC game. There's just something about fighting in the ring and being allowed to stomp on your opponent's head that screams early 2000s MMA. And don't worry, you get all of the Pride legends to play with to get the full experience, as well as Pride versions of UFC fighters that fall in Pride. The only fighter missing from the Pride roster is Fedor Emelianenko, but the UFC couldn't put him in the game due to licensing reasons. But the fighters you get are good enough in my opinion. The Pride music, the Japanese female announcer, everything just perfectly captures what Pride was about. There is so much more I could talk about this game, features that are not even in any of the EA UFC games, but this video would be way too long, and I think I've covered the main things that make this game the GOAT. You just really have to play it for yourself to really fully appreciate and understand why this game is so great. I don't think that the EA Sports UFC games are trash, but none of them feel like the complete package. EA Sports UFC pulled things from UFC Undisputed 3 and wasn't a bad game, but the execution wasn't there. UFC 2 was fun, but not a good representation of real life MMA. UFC 3 was the best UFC game EA made, but it isn't on the same tier as UFC Undisputed 3, not even close. And UFC 4 is just trash. The only credit I can give to UFC 4 is updating the roster to add fighters for free, and it has some good things about it, but none of these games will be missed. You can tell that with THQ and Ukes they actually cared about the license, just like they did with the WWE games, and they put out 3 games that still hold up well today in the UFC Undisputed series, ending with the best UFC game ever, UFC Undisputed 3. The one thing that everyone loved about UFC Undisputed series is that it focused on capturing the realistic aspects of MMA and was made for the hardcore MMA fans. Most companies these days have the mindset of creating a sports game that appeals to the casuals, who will only play the game for a couple of months, then move on to something else. But let me know your thoughts in the comments about UFC Undisputed 3, any memories you have of it, if you ever even played it. And if you haven't never played it, just get an emulator and try it out. It's honestly worth your time. But that's gonna be it for this video. I'm out this hoe.
Until he erase him. True to be tweaking like somebody laced him. I know some demons in Broward, they Haitian. Niggas ain't dropping no bodies, they fake. They can't get no passes if he wrote a statement. Can't get no passes if he wrote a statement.